All right, everyone. Thanks for joining. This class is on the COP and the SPRP, or the seller purchase of replacement property. So those two forms, it's the COP is used when the buyer has to sell their property in order to buy the seller's property. So that is the COP. And the SPRP is used when the seller wants to sell their house, but they want to find a replacement somewhere before they commit to selling their house. So it's the seller's need to find a replacement property. So I've showed this before, but I am going to show it to you guys who may not have seen it. It's a nice tool that CAR has. It's called, this is the homepage of CAR. Everybody should be seeing the homepage of CAR.org. This is how you get into Zipforms, and this is how you do many things. They have education, you can do designations, you can sign up for that there, and it gives a whole bunch of information regarding our state association. So I want to show you this tool that CAR offers agents. You go to the Transaction Center, and you can also get to your Zipforms from here. But I want to go down to here. It says Forms Advisor and Forms Tutor. So when you go to Forms Advisor to Forms Tutor, it brings you to this page. And we're going to go to Forms Tutor. Forms Advisor, you can play around with that. You can input stuff about your transaction, and it'll spit out what they think that you should, what forms that you should use for that transaction. But it takes a whole bunch of time, and but play around with it. See, you might enjoy using it. But let's go to Forms Tutor. Okay, you're going to have to sign in. You have to be up on your dues to the state. Okay, this is Forms Tutor. It's a member's benefit. And what they've done is they've taken some of the more common forms, and they have broken it down on how to use the forms. It's a great tool. You can look at many different forms on here, but they don't have all of the forms. But we are going to cover one that they do have is the seller purchase of replacement property. They do have that on here. They don't have the COP, unfortunately. They really should. But I'm going to go over this through the Forms Tutor. Where are you? Nope. I don't know if I can find it. There it is at the bottom. Seller's purchase of replacement property. Okay, so here is this form, seller's purchase of replacement property. It hasn't been updated since 2017, it looks like. So this is an addendum to the purchase contract, or it could be an addendum to a counteroffer. So either way, that's what this form is used for. But I want to point out that there's these little blue dots here, and these little blue dots are explanations about various paragraphs of this form. So if you go to the first blue dot at the top of the the form, it tells you about this form. The SPRP provides the contingency in favor of the seller for the seller's purchase of a replacement property. Sometimes sellers do not want to sell their property if they are uncertain about whether they can buy something themselves. The seller's concern could be based upon the difficulty of finding property, especially in this market. Or it could be that the seller just wants the security of knowing the seller has a permanent place to be once the seller's own property has sold. So that's what this form is used for. So we go down here and we look at the very first paragraph. 1A says, this agreement is contingent on the seller entering into a contract to acquire replacement property. Seller shall, within 17, defaults to 17 days after acceptance, remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement. If the seller does not remove the finding replacement property contingency in writing within that time, buyer, after first giving a notice to perform, may cancel the agreement. So here's a little explanation. It basically self-explanatory. But there's another part to this. 1B is seller has entered into a contract to acquire replacement property. So the seller is already in escrow. So you would check 1B and put the escrow information in there. And then here's also a option for this form, and that is to close escrow. The agreement is contingent on seller's ability to close escrow on the replacement property. So that is the third option in this on this form. So you're a buyer and you're buying the property, and you won't have I think it even says, it says it here, whether the seller has already found a replacement property or is still trying to locate one. The box in 1C can be checked, making the contingency last until the seller has closed escrow on the replacement property. In this situation, the buyer is at risk throughout the entire escrow period because either the seller or the seller's seller may take some action that causes the escrow to fail, which would in turn cause the failure of the escrow for the sale of the seller's property. What's that saying? It's saying that either the seller new property, something happens, they can cancel, or the seller of that property somehow can cancel, and that puts this deal in jeopardy. So because the buyer is at risk, if the seller cancels, the buyer may not want to spend money on inspections and reports until the seller has removed the contingency for the seller finding or closing upon a replacement property. So you've got a seller who wants the security of knowing that he's closing on his new property, but you want a buyer that you have a buyer that says, well, but at any minute I can expend all this money, and then at any minute the seller, if it's contingent on the close, the seller can cancel. So it is a tough contingency, and this is a tough form to get both parties satisfied. It is. Now in a seller's market, probably had a better chance of getting it to go through as the seller closing on that property. things are shifting now. So it may just be that the seller needs to find the property, remove the contingency, and then if things don't work out, then the seller needs to proceed with the sale and needs to find other accommodations at the close of escrow, like a rental or something. So that's what this is about. So that's section 1. It's all about finding the property and whether it's contingent, whether they're already in escrow, or it's contingent on the sale of the property. Section number 2, or item number 2, is about time periods. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations that commence from the date of acceptance shall begin the day after seller delivers to buyer a written list removing the finding replacement property contingency. Can everybody hear me? Because my ear thing went off. Somebody unmute and say, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear
Yep.
you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
I
we
can't
can.
hear you. Hold on. I'll get the other one. Hold on. Sorry. Technical difficulties. Okay. Hold on. Okay. You should now definitely be able to hear me. Okay. So the time periods in the day after the seller delivers a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency, or there's a checkbox here, remain as specified in the agreement. If close of escrow is identified as a specific date in the agreement, it shall remain the same. So you have the option here that inspections and everything happen per the agreement, per the time frame of the agreement. Or what they do is they happen after this contingency is removed. So that's what paragraph 2 is about. Robert, have the seller agree to pay the buyer's if the seller cancels. Yeah, you can add that into an addendum that should the seller cancel, the seller will reimburse the buyer for reports, but it isn't in this document. It's a risk that everybody's taking. All right. The addendum provides that the time period I just went over that they are after the removal is delivered. Buyer's deposit. The buyer's deposit shall be delivered in escrow within 3 days after seller delivers to buyer a written notice of removing the finding the replacement property. This is where most likely nobody's going to agree with this. At least the seller doesn't want it. The seller's going to want the buyer to have some skin in the game here. So they're going to check this box as specified in the agreement, which would mean that the buyer's deposit needs to be in within 3 business days of the acceptance. If that is not checked, then it's after they get the notice to remove the finding the replacement property. Excuse me. Third option is close of escrow. Buyer and seller agreed that seller may extend the close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for a maximum of X amount of days. So if you're holding everything off until time frames aren't taking place until after you have a removal of finding the replacement property. Remember, there are 2 removals here on the the contingency removal form. It's a removal of finding replacement property, and then there's also another contingency of closing on the replacement property. So there are two options on that contingency removal form. So this time frames would start as when the seller removes the finding the replacement property. So if you're waiting until everything to start until after you find that replacement property, you might have to add 30 days, 20, 30 days to the close of escrow. So that's what you would put in there. So section number 3, even after the expiration of time for the replacement property, finding replacement property specified in 1A, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels to paragraph 1A. Once buyer receives seller's written removal of the finding replacement property contingency, buyer may not cancel pursuant to 1A. So basically, buyer can cancel if the seller's dragging their feet and whatnot. So, and that is this form. I mean, it's not really that complicated a form, although people are afraid of it. Because there are a whole bunch of options, and the whole thing about the inspections and the time periods and all of that. But that is the form. So before I move on to the next form, does anybody have questions on this? I am not seeing any, so I'm going to stop that.
Hey, Rich, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Can you put an addendum that if the seller cancels, they will reimburse the buyer the inspection fees?
Yes, I said that just a few minutes ago. All right, so let's see. Let's go. Since Tutor does not cover the COP, we're going right to Zipforms. So you should be looking at the transaction page of Zipforms. All right. And now you should be looking at the contingency for sale of buyer's property and notice to remove contingencies. Okay. So once again, this is an addendum to the purchase agreement, or it could be an addendum to a counteroffer, either one of them. So number one, the default of this form is that the agreement is contingent on the buyer entering into a contract for the sale of and closing escrow on the buyer's property. That's the default. So they enter in a contract and they close escrow. That's the default. Now there's options that it's only entering into a 1B, only entering into a contract for the sale, or 1C, only the close of escrow on the buyer's property. So, but the default is if you do nothing in section number 1, it's contingent on that property closing. So that's important to note. Now, if the
sorry, Rick, can you make that a little bigger so we can see the form, please? Just a little bit. Thank you.
Well, I really can't. I'm up to the map. If you go to your, on the top it says view options or something. Just say fit the screen. It's the very first option, I think. Or wait, maybe I can, let me look. Can I? It's maybe one more I can do. Let's see. This, I think this is it. Wait, that's it. Okay. So that's about it. That's all I can do.
Thank
All
you.
right. So, all right. So, all right. So once again, it's defaults to finding, excuse me, entering into contract and closing. And as I said, if they're already in escrow, you put the escrow information. You put the escrow information there, a copy of the contract and the contact information for the escrow company is attached to the COP, or it will be delivered to the seller within 2 days after acceptance. So that's if it's already in escrow. So section number 2, buyer entering into contract for the sale. If 1A or 1B applies, the buyer, excuse me, has X amount of days, defaults to 17 after acceptance, to enter into a contract for the sale of the buyer's property. Now, if you didn't check anything on 1, you left it as is. So it's contingent on the contract and it's contingent on the close. So if the buyer has 17 days to enter into a contract, if the buyer doesn't find something in that 17 days, the buyer still can cancel with after that 17 days. So that's important. So so you want to be realistic in how long the buyer has to find a property. So 2B, by the earlier of the time specified in 2A, within 2 days after the buy. That's a weird way of putting it. By the earlier of the time specified. Anyways, all it means is within that 17 days, if the buyer enters into a contract, the buyer has 2 days after entering into that contract to deliver the escrow, the evidence of escrow. So that's all that means. So that's section number 2. Listing in MLS status. So if this is contingent on the buyer selling their property, it should already be listed theoretically. So the default is the buyer has signed a listing agreement for the buyer's property, or shall, within 3 days after acceptance, sign a listing agreement with whatever brokerage they're working with. And 3B is buyer's property is and will be submitted to the MLS where the buyer's property is located, or you can check the box, buyer's property will not be submitted to the MLS. Now, I don't know why you would want to accept this if you're a seller, if they're not going to put it in the MLS, because you want the widest net to see this property in order to get it to be sold. Buyers shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and the MLS listing within 1 day after acceptance if buyer's property is already listed. If not listed, within 1 day after listing. So the seller has a right to see that listing agreement, has a right to see the MLS sheet on that property. So they have a day to deliver that. So close of escrow of buyer's property. If 1A or C applies, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. The scheduled close of escrow of sales of buyer's property, the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property, or if checked, no later than 5 days prior to the schedule close of escrow on seller's property. Once buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel the agreement. So once you've sold it, you suddenly say, well, you've changed your mind. You can't say, well, it's because of the sale of the property. I didn't get enough money for the property. Yeah, say you didn't get enough, you accepted an offer, it wasn't really the offer you wanted. You're not netting enough. Once you close, that ship is kind of sailed, as they say. You can't say, well, I didn't make enough money, so I'm not going to buy your property using that contingency, because that contingency is gone. Status of sale of buyer's property. If 1A or C applies, buyer agrees to keep seller informed about the status of the transaction, including all changes and modifications, addenda or amendments to the terms, or delays to or removal of contingencies. You have the right to say, well, have they removed their inspection contingency, or have they removed the appraisal contingency? Where are you in this process? They have the right to know. Within 2 days after seller's written request, but no earlier than the applicable time to remove contingencies in the contract of the sale of buyer's property, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of the removal of those identified contingencies. Okay, cancellation of buyer's property. If the buyer's property is in or enters escrow, and either party in that escrow gives the other a notice of cancellation, buyer within 2 days thereafter shall deliver to the seller written notice of that cancellation. That's pretty self-explanatory. So this paragraph 7, is what trips a lot of people up. Backup offers and seller's right to require buyer to remove contingencies or cancel. 7A says, after acceptance, seller shall have the right to continue to offer the seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge that the broker shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. What does that mean? Listing agents, you cannot leave it in active status if there is a contract that has this contingency on it. It has to be active under contract. You can't leave it inactive just to look for offers who don't have this contingency. Then have your seller not accept an offer with this contingency. 7B, removal of buyer's contingency and proof of funds. So this says, unless paragraph 7C3, which we'll get to in a bit, is selected, if seller accepts a written backup offer and provides the buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified in 7C1, seller shall have the right to give written notice to the buyer in writing to 1, remove this contingency, 2, remove the loan contingency, and if any, and 3, provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. Seller may use the bottom of page 2 of this form to comply with the written notice requirement of the paragraph. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing. So what that is saying is that while this contingency is in place, if the seller gets a backup offer that doesn't have this contingency on it, or even is a better offer, the seller can say to the buyer, I'm going to accept this backup offer, and you need to remove this contingency and show me you can move forward without the sale of this property. So that's what this 7B says. C time to give notice to remove contingencies. So this is what you want you as the buyer's agent want to put forth. The seller shall have the right to invoke the notice, to give notice to remove. Seller shall have the right to invoke the notice provisions in 7B. It defaults to immediate right to notify anytime after acceptance. You want to check 2, delayed right to notify buyer no earlier than, it defaults to 17 days. You can make that whatever day you want. But what that says is that for this time period, seller cannot say to the buyer, have a backup offer, remove these contingencies and step aside. So you want to invoke some sort of limit on that, the seller's ability. So the first one is number 2. The second one is 3, no right to notify buyer. I doubt that you will ever get this approved by go by the seller unless it goes into a total buyer's market. And that is no right to, the seller shall not have the right to invoke the provisions in 7B during the entire term of the agreement. So, so that's your choices. You need to limit the time when the seller can push your buyer aside. Now, those who are the listing agents, if in a seller's market, you can say, no, I'm not going to give you any time. If the seller gets a backup offer, the seller gets a better backup offer, the seller gets a better backup offer, and you guys need to remove that contingency. So, all right, section number 8, removal of contingency. This contingency can only be removed in writing, as all contingencies are. Seller's right to cancel. Seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. First, ever giving a buyer a notice to perform. After giving buyer notice to perform, if buyer fails to enter into a contract for the sale of the property within the specified time, or after giving the notice to perform, the buyer fails to close escrow within the time specified. After giving the buyer notice to perform, the buyer fails to deliver escrow evidence within the time specified. So even the failure of the buyer to give evidence that they're in escrow, the seller can cancel. After first giving the buyer a notice to perform, if buyer fails to deliver evidence of the listing of buyer's property, they don't show that it's been listed, the seller can cancel. If buyer fails to deliver evidence of removal of contingencies in the sale of the property, if buyer gives notice to seller or of either party's cancellation, the seller can cancel. So buyer's right to cancel. Buyer may cancel the agreement. Obviously, if the buyer is unable to get under contract, either party of the buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel, he can cancel. The buyer is unable to close on the buyer's property if 1A or C applies only. So, excuse me. Section 11, time for performance of contract obligations and delivery of buyer's deposit. Contract obligations other than deposit. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, close of escrow, and other obligations, excluding those in this addendum, shall begin. The default for this is as specified in the agreement, meaning deposit needs to be in within 3 days. Inspections have to take place according to the agreement. All of that is per the agreement. Or you can check on the day after buyer delivers to seller any of the following: escrow evidence, buyer's election in writing signed by buyer to begin time periods, or buyer's removal of this contingency for the sale. Excuse me. So if you were the seller, you wouldn't want to wait until after the buyer, gets into escrow. You want them to do everything up front. Buyer's deposit. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within the time frame of this agreement, once again, or it can be delayed. Now, right here, right on this form, is where the seller, if he wants to invoke that right, to say, Mr. Buyer, you need to remove this contingency because I have a backup offer. You don't need a separate notice to perform. You do it right here and deliver that to the buyer, and notice has been given. And if they don't perform within the two days, then the seller can cancel. So that's the COP. Anybody have any questions on the COP? Anyone? Dealer?
Seller only signs the bottom if a backup offer is already in place and accepted.
Correct. And they have the right to give notice to the seller to remove the contingency. If there is that delayed, 7.2 is checked and they don't have the right, then they cannot use that. But if they have the right to give this notice, then that's all that they have to do is sign the bottom. Anybody else? All right, well, that's it. We ended a little early. I hope it was informative. If any agents are here from Studio City, I want to welcome you to my classes. If not, nobody's here.
I'm Studio City.
Oh, great. Also ask that if anybody has any any suggestions that they want me to teach, drop me a line. I'm always looking for something new. I know Studio City that Nina would do the same kind of classes and kind of rotate them. I'm a little kind of freer, because I record them. And you can always refer to them. These will go out to the offices and they can distribute them. Michael, August is a bad month for me. I've got NAR meetings. I leave this weekend for NAR. I've got leadership meetings because next year I'm the president of SRAR. And then Mega Camp. Anybody going to Mega Camp, I'm going to be there, so you can see me there. But I will make it to Studio City in September. I promise. Like I said, any suggestions, send them my way. Which reminds me, Mega Camp. My next scheduled class is while I'm in Mega Camp, so I'm not. This is the only class for this this month. Usually I do two, but unfortunately this is a killer month for me. So I will see everybody in September, the beginning of September. Send me your suggestions, and I'd be happy to cover stuff that you're interested in learning about. All right, I appreciate everybody stopping in and listening to the class. And until next time, all right? See ya.
Hey, Rich, before you go, I just have a quick question. Just with everything that's happening right now in the real estate market, there's a lot of uncertainty. There are people that they are thinking that the market's going to crash. And I'm just wondering, if we ever
It's
did,
crashing tomorrow, Mona. Tomorrow's the day.
no, but seriously, if it did
Yes.
crash, no, like my objection handler to people, if it does crash, people in the middle class, they're not really going to benefit from it, right? Because the economy has to get so bad, and it's only going to be like, you know, the 1%, the people who have money on hand, you know, the people on Wall Street who are buying up homes, those are the people who are going to benefit, right? What do you think?
Well, here's the thing. The market's not going to crash. We are not in the same situation that we were in 2006,
I agree
2007.
100%. I agree.
We are not there. We're not in those dire straits. I mean, I got stuck in those dire straits. I bought a house at the peak of the market at 6.85% interest, and was planning on flipping it or living in it for 2 years and then selling both of my houses and, you know, doing that. I got stuck there for 10 years, but I never thought I'd get the money out, and I eventually did. The thing is, it's not going to crash, and that's what you have to say to your clients. We're not in that market. It's not going to crash. It's like, interest rates are 5%. My first house, I was paying 13. So, you know, we were all used to the 3s and the 4s. You know, it's not going to be the dire straits, and that's what we have to say, because it really isn't. So I don't foresee the market crashing. Economists don't see the market crashing. You know, you listen to Oscar Way, who many of the offices have, and it's not going to do that. So affordability is an issue. You know, that's just where we live, and even rentals. Nobody can afford a rental. So it's when you're talking about the middle class. I mean, I don't even know what the middle class is in Los Angeles anymore. It's just it's who are people going to be? Is there going to be such a price drop that anybody's going to benefit? Economists are saying no. We're probably going to end the year a little up, not as far up as we anticipated it was going to be, but there's not going to be a depression of the depression is the wrong word. There's not going to be a dip in the prices that everybody is fearing. It's just not going to happen, and things are probably going to recover next year, second quarter. So I know it doesn't really answer your question, but I don't think that that's the right question, because it's not a legitimate scenario, because I don't think that that's where we're at, and nobody else thinks that.
I agree with you 100%, everything you're saying. I was going to make a video about it, saying, if it did crash, would that really benefit people? Right? Hypothetically.
But why would you make a video saying, if it crashes, feeding into the fear? That's not the right way to go. Okay. You shouldn't be feeding into the fear. You should be comforting and advising people that that's not what people are saying. You should be reporting what people are saying, and that is that we may end up a little slower at the end of the year, but we're not going to be, listen to what these economists are saying. Listen to, regarding our market. Don't listen to the, inflation and all of that stuff. Educate yourself on the real estate market and what experts in the market are saying. And that's what you should be reporting. Okay.
Got it.
All right. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Until next time, have a good month.